This is my favourite lens for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro. In fact, it's my favourite lens for any camera, my Blackmagic 4K, my Canon ESR, but I don't want to talk about this lens just yet. First, I want to talk about some other lenses that as a Blackmagic camera owner, you might find interesting. First up is my choice for a super wide angle lens, the Tokina 11-16mm f2.8. This is a great lens for landscapes and establishing shots. It's also very useful for shooting in any sort of cramped location like bathrooms. But, because it's so wide, you will get a strange effect from the distortion if panning and tilting. But that's common with almost all super wide angle lenses. It's an APS-C lens or a super 35mm, however you like to think about it. The 11-16mm is close to the 17-24mm on a full frame camera. This is about as wide as you would go before you start to get into the fisheye lens territory. The first thing that you notice when you pick up this lens is that it's pretty heavy and has a solid, well-made feel to it. I mean, you could easily bludgeon a man to death with this lens. It's also a relatively fast lens, having an f-stop of 2.8. I can't actually think of a super wide angle zoom lens that has a faster f-stop. Let me know down in the comments if you know of one. Focusing with this lens is a little unusual as it has this movable focus ring turning autofocus on and off. Once you get used to it, it's actually quite a nice little feature. The downside to this lens is it doesn't have image stabilization. This doesn't matter so much with a wide angle lens. You're so wide at 11mm that any micro movements are kind of dampened, but it would have been nice, especially as a 6K Pro is prone to the old rolling shutter wobbles. I had to replace the lens cap because the original one kept popping off all the time. It was like it was allergic to the front element and wanted to get as far away as possible. So I bought this replacement one off eBay, and it's so much better. A couple of years ago, Tokina gave this lens a refresh. As far as I know, it was totally cosmetic, and the optics and autofocus motor are exactly the same as the original style one. So if you're looking at picking one of these up used, then don't assume it's of a lesser quality. Or, if you're thinking of buying one of these new, don't assume it's of a better quality than the older version. The new version of this lens is about 400 quid, but a good used old version should be around 250. The main alternative to this lens would probably be the Canon 10-18mm. For me, the faster aperture makes it a win for the Tokina, but the Canon is a good lens also. Next up is this stubby little bad boy, the Sigma 30mm f1.4 EX DC HSM. This is like the granddaddy to all those excellent art lenses that Sigma now makes. It's small and compact, nice and light, and at f1.4 pretty fast. You can get a nice bokeh and image quality is more than reasonable. 30mm on a Super 35 sensor gives a field of view equivalent of about 45mm on a full frame camera. I use this lens as a normal lens for when I want to isolate a subject with a nice out of focus background. The big drawback to this lens is that, like the Tokina, it doesn't have image stabilization. At 30mm, this means you're likely to get the old wobbly footage if you use this lens handheld without some sort of stabilization. Again, this lens has had a cosmetic update and will cost around £400. A good used copy should set you back about £150. Now you're probably thinking that at some point I'm going to talk about the Sigma 18-35mm f1.8. Well, there's two reasons why I'm not going to include it on this list. Number one is that I think it's a little bit obvious. Everyone seems to pair that lens up with these cameras. And number two, I don't actually own it, so I'd feel a little bit stupid recommending and talking about a lens that I have no experience of. But I do actually have a kind of general all-purpose zoom lens coming up on the list right now. This lens isn't as good as the last two, but I probably use it more often. It's the Tamron 17-50mm f2.8 RXDI2. This lens is a jack of all things and a master of none, but it is super versatile. 17-50mm is around 24-70mm on a full frame camera, a real workhorse zoom range. It goes from wide to telephoto with a constant 2.8 aperture. If you're unaware, having a constant aperture through the zoom range means you can zoom in and out without having to make exposure changes because the image isn't getting darker as the aperture automatically closes as you zoom. This lens also has vibration control. That's Tamron speak for image stabilization. This makes this lens great for handheld shooting. The lens has okay build quality, the zoom ring is a bit clunky, you can't exactly do a slow zoom in on a subject. The lens gets longer and shorter as you zoom in and out. For me, this isn't a big problem, but if you like to use a matte box and filters, you're going to have some trouble. An alternative to this lens would be the Canon 17-55mm f2.8, but that lens is £850 new. The Tamron new is about half the price, and a good used copy is around £150 to £200. So just before I tell you my absolute favourite lens to film with on these cameras, if you've managed to get to this point in the video, then please consider giving it a like and maybe even subscribing if you haven't already, as it really is a big help to me. Cheers. Now, back to where we were when this whole thing started. This is my favourite lens for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro. In fact, it's my favourite lens for any camera. Blackmagic 4K, my Canon EOS R, I love it for filming with, and I love it for shooting photos with. It's the Canon EF 24mm f1.4L Mark II USM. What I like about this lens is it's a wide angle lens, but it's not too extreme. You can use it for shooting practically anything. It doesn't have crazy distortion like a super wide angle lens. I think my favourite focal lengths are between 20 and 40mm. On a super 35mm sensor camera like the 6K Pro, this lens has a field of view of about 38mm, so it's right in that range. It's an f1.4, so it's good in low light situations, and the bokeh is pretty good. It's an L series lens, which means it has super build quality and is dust and weather sealed. Not that that's going to be too much use on the 6K Pro, because it's not weather sealed, so you can't use it in the rain anyway. This is the only full frame lens on this list, and in a kind of strange way it sort of future-proofs it, as video cameras and cinema cameras are moving into the full frame territory these days. So it gives me a little bit of reassurance that I'm going to be able to use this lens for a little bit longer with a wider variety of cameras. Downsides are no image stabilization, and it's very expensive. In fact, it's £1,500 new and £800 for a good used copy. That's probably too much money for most people watching this video to spend on a lens, and I agree. I got a good deal on mine used, and I'm glad that I did, but I accept it's probably out of the budget for most people. However, having said that, lenses can be a good investment and lose their value much slower than camera bodies. If you buy smart, you can probably use the same lens for 15 to 30 years, no problemo.